This episode is sponsored by Oblong Books and Northeast Ford. Hey Mary, how are you doing today?
I am fine and very excited to introduce our next guest for the podcast.
This is our second Moxie by Proxy.
Yes, and to remind our listeners, Moxie by Proxy is where we deputize someone who is knowledgeable about a historical figure.
So not just someone.
Right, and a quote-unquote expert.
There you go.
So writer, historian. In this case, it's Roger Berkowitz, who is the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. And so he is joining us to talk about Hannah Arendt, who he has been studying and immersing himself in for the past 20 years.
Sounds fantastic. Let's get into it.
Yes, so just by way of little introduction, Hannah Arendt is a political thinker from her kind of productive period probably was the 40s through the 60s, but she was an observer of political life and had very definite ideas about citizenship and involvement in the political sphere being open to us all. And hopefully Roger will shed some light on that, and let's get to it.
The great thing about having Oblong as a sponsor of this episode is the fact that all of the books mentioned in this episode, as well as listed in the show notes, can be bought at Oblong.
Oblong bookstores have this amazing, chill literary vibe, and I love soaking it up while I'm scanning the titles.
My favorite thing is going into the children's section for the books, the toys. They are just fantastic. And my other favorite thing is that I follow them on social media, and their posts are so engaging, so visual, and I just love to see all the books that they're promoting and the authors and author signings that they have.
And Oblong Books, they aren't just bricks and mortar in the community. They are all in the community, active in many ways. You can find them at 26 Main Street in Millerton and Montgomery Row in Rhinebeck, and their website is www.oblongbooks.com.
Roger, thank you for coming all the way from Bard and making the trek over.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I actually love to be in Millerton.
Great. We so appreciate it. The first question we always ask our guests is, how would you define Moxie?
Well, it's a term that I don't often know where it comes from. We were talking about that before. What's the etymology of it? But I think of it as someone who's adventurous in spirit and life and willing to speak their truth. One of my professors always said to me, "Speak your truth," and I think that's what Moxie is to me.
I like that.
Yeah, and since you are the Moxie by Proxy that we have deputized to talk about Hannah Arendt, who you've made a lot of your life's work, how do you think she would define it?
Well, Hannah Arendt got into a lot of trouble for speaking her truth, and when she did, she often talked to her friends and she asked them and herself, should she have held back? Should she have not said things that, one thing people don't understand is that she answered thousands of letters from people around the Adolf Eichmann book, people who were writing her really angry letters, and she answered them. And she, said to them, "I'm sorry you're upset." She really did feel badly that she hurt people with the book. But when she asked herself honestly, should she have not written what she did, she said, no, it was the truth. And the truth needs to be heard. And so what I love about Hannah Arendt, and I think the main reason that I've dedicated the last 20 years of my life to her and her work, is that she always looked at every question, every event, every encounter that she wrote about and thought about and said, how can I think about this? Right? Not what should I think about it, not what the virtuous way of thinking about it, not what the liberal or conservative way to think about it, but what does it mean and how can I make sense of it? And let me say what I think, to think what we are doing, to be who I am. And her work is always surprising. what I tell my students, and I even tell some of my colleagues, is that when I read you, I want to be surprised. I don't want to know, I want you to go down an alleyway that was not expected, and then bring it somewhere bright and beautiful, and sometimes dark. But that's what I like about her. She was bold, she was provocative, not because she wanted to be bold and provocative, because she thought for herself, and that is such a rare quality in our world, anytime. Sadly, more now than it was 20 or 30 years ago, because of the need for everybody to conform and need for everybody to say the right thing and not offend anybody and be on the right team. And Hannah Arendt always refused to play on a team. When she wrote the book on Eichmann and people said, but you're a Jew, she said, well, I am a Jew, and I'll always never deny that, but the people I care about are my friends, not the Jewish thought. And when people said to her, well, you're a liberal, she said, no, I'm not. And when they said, you're a conservative, she said, no, I'm not. She said, I'm a thinker, and the only team that I'm on are mine and my friends. And that incredible self-awareness, substink, and the ability to think for oneself, that's to me Moxie, and that's how I think she understood it.
So can you put her in historical context of just a little biography of who she was and why she made a splash back in the 40s through 60s?
Yeah. She was born in 1906 in Germany as a Jew. She was arrested in 1933 for working for a Zionist organization. She charmed the young police officer who arrested her, and he let her go. To say something else, before this happened, she had an affair with the most famous German and European philosopher of the 20th century, Martin Heidegger. She escaped to France, and in France worked for Jewish causes primarily. Then was put into a concentration camp in France in Gurs, escaped that, went to New York, and in New York wrote for Jewish German publications, and then wrote her first published book, not her first book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which hit the world like a bomb. I mean, it was an extraordinary book, an attempt not to argue the causes, but to look at the various wild elements that led to totalitarianism, both in Nazi Germany, and this is one of the things that made it very controversial, also in Soviet Russia, Bolshevik Russia. And the first 100 pages are on anti-Semitism, which she then also incredibly controversially and with great moxie said is not the same thing as anti-Jewishness or Jew hatred. And she says that you have to look at anti-Semitism not as simply part of the eternal hatred of Jews, but as something that was particular to the modern world, and that it's not simply treating Jews as a scapegoat. There was a reason for it. Now when people read this and hear this, they think, oh my God, she's blaming the victim. She's not. She has no way attempting or blaming the Jews. But she's saying you have to look at what happened and what the Jews were doing. And one of the things they were doing was separating themselves off because they were a discriminated minority. They were not allowed to vote in most places, so they became an insular minority. They separated themselves from society. They were then, because they didn't have equality, they got privileges from the government. Mm-hmm. And as a result, they were seen by people, they were associated with the government. And when people turned anti-government, the Jews were seen as a proxy for the government. Oh. And so she says, look, there were reasons for it, and we have to understand it. When I teach this, I look at it and say to my students, who does this remind you of today? What are groups that are discriminated against in our society and are appealing to the government for aid, mm-hmm. and are often disproportionately employed in government jobs, mm-hmm. and given things like affirmative action? And then when there are people who turn anti-government, they also
get swept
up in that. It's not dissimilar. That's not blaming the victim. It's an attempt to deeply understand the historical, theoretical, cultural, intellectual elements that go into things like the rise of totalitarian movements. And if we just end up with cliches, we're not going to get there. And if there was anything Hannah Arendt was allergic to, it was cliched thinking.
Right. How would she define totalitarianism?
Totalitarianism for Hannah Arendt is a mass movement, so of lonely, atomized individuals that is united by an ideological program that gives their meaningless lives a sense of coherence and meaning. So by mass, she means people who no longer are part of a organized class. They could be rich, they could be poor, they could be educated, they could be uneducated, but they don't fit in, and they don't seem to have any class that represents them. And so they fall out of class, they fall out of society, and they lose a sense of purpose and meaning in life. And they get brought together not by political interests or economic interests, but by an ideological program. And you see this in a number of areas in our world today, both on the right, where you have a lot of people in the Trump movement who are clearly, some are rich, some are poor, some are workers, some are, businessmen. They don't actually share a whole lot of political and economic interests, but they feel alienated and humiliated in our society. And they're brought together by an ideology. Similarly, in what we might call the woke left, you have multimillionaires, you have college presidents, you have college professors, you have adjunct professors, you have nonprofit workers. These are not people who form a coherent, economic class, but they share an ideology, a kind of sense of superiority over people who they think don't understand a kind of social justice mentality. And these are warring ideological movements that we're seeing growing in front of our eyes today. They're not totalitarian yet, but I would qualify them both in Hannah Arendt's terminology as proto-totalitarian movements.
I'm still processing.
While you're processing,
Yeah, thanks.
how would she recommend one creates a sense of meaning to avoid the pitfalls of a life of alienation and descending into or filtering out of class or society?
Aaron, that's an excellent question, and it's maybe the hardest question, right? Because part of the depth of her analysis is that this is something that is deep roots, and it's rooted in the loss of a tradition, which she calls the break of tradition. So the Western tradition, which, people say she's loves the Greeks, and she did, but she didn't think the Greeks started our tradition. She thought the Romans started our tradition. And this tradition, which provided a sense of authority and social cohesion and what she calls banisters, right? The idea that when you have a tradition, whether it's religious or traditional or just, customary, you take your hat off, you open the door, you listen to people when you argue with them, etc. These traditions provide banisters that keep us in line.
The guardrails.
The guardrails. And she thinks that with the rise of the Enlightenment first, with the loss, with then the questioning of tradition, the loss of religious belief. I mean, yes, people still believe, but the religion has not the central piece in our society as it used to. The guardrails have come off, and she says that they finally were broken during the Holocaust and the Bolshevik purges. And after that, any attempt to recreate the Western guardrails, the Western tradition, she called nostalgia. So, the idea of make the West great again or reinvigorate the West is destined to fail. And she doesn't think you can just go back. Those ideas have been lost. I mean, they're not lost. People know what they are, but they're no longer organic. And to go back to them is artificial, it's not going to work. So how do you create a new tradition? It's one of the hardest questions. And I don't think she had an answer in the sense that this is the tradition we should use. She didn't. But what she did believe, and this was her belief, is that the only way to create such a tradition was to talk honestly,
Right.
to listen to people. She did believe, and so in the last 10 years of her life, one of the key topics of her writing was revolution. She wrote a book called On Revolution about the American and French revolutions. She wrote a lot about revolution. And revolution was interesting for her, not because it was founding something completely new, but it was a revolution. It was returning back to basic principles, but in a new way. And the only way to build a new foundation, a new tradition, is to sit down and talk honestly with each other and find, amidst many disagreements, what are the few little things we agree on, and start there. You have to start small. One of the big problems we have, and I'll speak here for the United States where I'm based, is that on both the left and the right, people know, one side wants abortion for everyone and one side wants no abortions for everybody. Well, that's great. I'm on one side, right? But we're not going to convince everybody, right? And at some point you have to say, all right, instead of getting the 10 that you want, what's the 2 or 3 that you can live with that we can all agree on and build a new foundation? And sadly, neither side is really ready for that conversation yet. But to me, that kind of talking and finding the low level, the least common denominator. She has a line which is one of my favorite lines, and she uses it in many places in the last 5 or 6 years of her life, where she says, talking about justice and piety will actually make the world more just and more pious. And what she means is that if we actually have these conversations and we talk about it and we disagree, but then we find, there are things we do agree on, then we can build from that. But that takes a long time.
Yeah.
And people don't have that patience right now. And people are still too, can I use the word arrogant, self-certain, assured, and they want their view of justice and their view of piety to be accepted by everybody. But that's just not the way the world is. I mean, one of the central concepts of Hannah Arendt's thought is plurality. We are plural, and that means we all are different. And she doesn't see that as a weakness. She sees that as a strength. The diversity argument that you hear today is not the same as plurality, because the diversity argument says we all should believe in diversity in the same way. And that's not Arendt's view.
With her thoughts on revolution and setting the baseline, what about evolution of things? What was her viewpoint of that? Because we evolve, we grow, maybe we have the same traditions, but as times change, circumstances change. What was her viewpoint towards evolution of things?
As in the sense I mentioned before about how talking about justice and piety makes the world more just and pious, you build a foundation. And once you have a foundation, you can build lots of different houses. Right? I mean, I'm not a builder, but an architect, but I do know that if you have a strong foundation, you can put all sorts of different structures on it. And one of the things she really loved about the United States, and she moved here as a stateless person, was stateless for 17 years of her life, finally became an American citizen, and really did, I have to say, love the United States, although she was also very critical of it at many times. And I think she felt that, in fact, she wrote a whole article about that. To be a true American, you had to value civil disobedience, and civil disobedience was at the core of what it meant to be an American. And that's one thing she liked about it. But one of the things she loved about America was her belief that, unlike in Europe, where if you were a German, you were a German, and if you're a French, you're French. In America, you could be a Jew, you could be a Muslim, you could be, a pagan, you could be anything and still be an American.
Right.
She called it the only modern state that's not a nation state. And by that, she meant we're not all French or we're not all German. Americans are mongrels.
Right.
And she loved that about America. And the foundation that she saw in America was that we all could be free and equal citizens. Now, obviously, there's a critique of that, and we've not all been free and equal, and she was very aware of that, and she wrote about that. But she thought the idea of it was deeply meaningful and right. And she believed that it was important she believed in federalism, not just state federalism or dual federalism, as constitutional lawyers put it, where you have the federal government and the state. Mm-hmm. She believed deeply in the power of local government.
Okay.
She believed deeply in the power of towns. And she thought that one of the great things about America was this tradition of local activism and local town government, which would create power centers that would resist the states and the federal government. Oh. And this federalist structure was important to her. So if you have a foundation, then you can have in the South certain towns, and in Georgia some towns, and in Atlanta other towns. And the point is, she was much more willing to accept plurality on a strong foundation than people are today. And so the evolution is build a foundation and then let people live differently. That's how I would take her on evolution. The problem is that we live at a time which everyone wants people to live the way they think they should live.
Yeah.
And that to her was deeply antithetical to what she saw as the pluralistic vision of American society.
In the article that I wrote about your work, you talk about citizenship as Hannah Arendt would have defined it, and it's something like political and ethical beings living within laws that govern us all. Do you think that's a definition people could live with, or does it really have to mean membership in a state?
Well, when I say political and ethical laws in which we live, that's what Hannah Arendt would call a state, but not a nation state, right? The difference is a state is simply a political entity that treats everybody equally according to laws. A nation state is a state that privileges some people over others because they're the national group of the state.
Okay.
Again, what Arendt loved about the United States was that it was not a nation state. Now, there's a critique of that, right? Which is that it was a nation state. It was a white state. It was a racial state. And I think that's a meaningful critique that one has to address. And I think Arendt does address it in certain places. That said, the idea of America as not a nation state is one that Arendt thought deeply valuable and should be maintained. There are many people today who say that because it wasn't truly that and because it was a white state, we should ditch the idea. I disagree with that, but it's a totally legitimate opinion. And people who have that opinion, I think, we should listen to them, and we have to talk to them, and they have to talk to me, and we have to find our lowest common denominator of how we can actually, make what we are saying a foundation for something new and better.
Right. I want to circle back to the Eichmann trial and that concept that I think she's most known for, the banality of evil that is also misunderstood. And can you set the record straight about what that term actually means?
So first of all, it's a very complicated idea. And so, there's people who simply don't want to know what it means and just want to critique her, right? And let's just say there are a lot of people who've never read her who go on and on about how she was an anti-Semite, even though she was a Jew who worked for Jewish issues her whole life, because she called Eichmann banal. Let's leave them out.
They're not our listeners.
They're not our listeners. Although I will say that I spoke next door here at the Millerton Theater when the Eichmann, when the movie on Hannah Arendt came out, and there was someone in there who yelled and screamed at me for defending an anti-Semite. So some of them, exist even in Millerton, but most are not. There are different arguments. One is that Hannah Arendt got something deeply right about the kind of people who were Nazis and Bolsheviks, but she was wrong about Eichmann. This is a common trope. And it's been strengthened recently by a really amazing book, Eichmann for Jerusalem, which is translated as Eichmann Before Jerusalem, by Bettina Stengneth, a German scholar, independent scholar, who did enormous amounts of research. And basically, all the book takes place before Israel kidnaps Eichmann and takes him to Jerusalem for trial, and talks about things he said and wrote while he was in Buenos Aires, and argues that Arendt simply didn't have access to this material, and she didn't understand the depths of Eichmann's hatred for Jews. Mm-hmm. It's a brilliant book. That said, there's almost no engagement with Arendt's argument in the book. She just says Arendt didn't know it, and therefore she couldn't have known this. Two things. One is, a bunch of this material, not all of it, but a bunch of it, was published, and Arendt read it. Mm-hmm. She talks about it in her book. In fact, almost all of the parts of what Eichmann said in the Sassen papers, these interviews that the book is based on in Buenos Aires, that Bettina Stengneth says show that Arendt didn't know, were published and Arendt spoke about. So you can't say Arendt didn't know it. You can't, that's sort of a fake thing. She did. The question is, did she get it wrong? And I think that's an interesting question. And that actually requires you understand what Arendt meant. And so what I say is, since Arendt knew this stuff and she read it, you actually have to take that into account in understanding what she calls banality. Mm-hmm. So a few things. She never says Eichmann wasn't an anti-Semite. She says once or twice, he said he wasn't an anti-Semite, and we find this incredibly hard to believe. It seems unlikely that she thought he was not an anti-Semite. I think she did think that in 1932, when he joined the Nazi Party, in 1934, when he joined the SD, then became part of the SS, he wasn't an anti-Semite. He became more and more caught up in German ideology and anti-Semitic ideology during the war, as did many Germans at the time and Nazis at the time. So what does banality mean for Arendt? It doesn't mean that he wasn't evil. She thought he was evil, and if you read the book, she says he should be hung. And he should be hung and extinguished from this earth because of what he did was so evil. So people who think you had a lot of people saying she wrote a defense brief for Eichmann. I mean, this is ridiculous, right? Doesn't make any sense. She says to a German journalist who interviews her, says, here's what I mean by banality. Ernst Jünger, a brilliant German writer, after World War I, sees a bunch of POWs freed from a camp, and they're emaciated. And they get out of the camp, and they're scrounging in the dirt looking for bugs to eat. And a German soldier looks at them and says, these are pigs, they're swine, they're not human. And Arendt says to the journalist, that inability to see the world from another perspective, that's what I mean by banality. And what she meant in calling Eichmann banal was that he got caught up in this ideological prison. And even though he didn't think of himself as a bad person, and he, if you watch the trial, and you can watch it, there's a great movie called The Specialist by A.L. Sivan, an Israeli writer, in which there's nothing in it except Eichmann talking at the trial, or the not just him, but people at the trial. You see, he admits, what I did was one of the worst things in history, but I was not a bad person. I was trying to help. I was trying to do things. I was doing my job. And what she says is he had no ability to think from the perspective of others. He had no self-critical faculty. And that is banality. And what she raises as a question is, look, there's always going to be evil people in the world. Mm-hmm. But they're few. I mean, evil people in the sense that they want to kill Jews or want to kill blacks or they want to kill anyone, right? But they're few people. And the world is filled with evil, but modern evil, which kills not 10 people or one person or 100 people, but millions of people, that can only happen when you have thousands and thousands of people who stop thinking and simply go along with bureaucratic orders that don't seem evil on their face, but are part of an evil system. And that's what she calls the banality of evil. That evil is based on thousands of people who are not monsters. They're just thoughtless people doing their jobs.
Who want some kind of meaning or purpose and being attached to something larger than themselves?
Exactly.
What about conscience? Doesn't it play
Yeah, it's
into that?
a great point. So one of the parts of the trial of Eichmann that she found most interesting, and she writes about in her book, is Eichmann says, and again says it both in Buenos Aires and at the trial, that, you know, I mean, we have to remember that. I mean, I hate, it's hard to do this in a short period of time,
Right, of
because
course.
because this is a complicated and nuanced
Sure.
argument. So
We trust you can do it.
well, we have to remember that from 1932 to 1933, the Nazis were. I mean, if you read Hitler, he's talking about killing the Jews.
Yeah.
But the Nazis were a party. They won 33% of the vote, and you know, a lot of what they said was semi-normal.
Right.
You have to read Hitler and Himmler, then you're not normal.
Yeah.
But what many of them were saying was semi-normal. Then from 34 till 38, Eichmann, who was in charge of the Reichssicherheitsamt 4B4, in charge of the Jewish question, his job was to deport or help emigrate the Jews. And if you listen to the Jews testify at the trial, many of them said, look, he treated us with respect. The laws were he had to take our money, but he wanted us to get out. We wanted to get out, and he was the person helping us get out. He called himself a Zionist. Arendt laughs at this, and yet she understands that there's a way in which it makes sense. He was like, look, I need to get these Jews out of here. They deserve their own country. And, you know, again, I'm not trying to say he was a nice guy. I don't think he was. But he saw himself as actually as he said, it was a mutually beneficial pact. You know, you don't have to believe him, but that's what he called it. And then from 38 to 41, his job is not emigration, deportation, it's concentration. Only after 42 is it extermination. And, you know, again, this is not to excuse anything.
No.
It's simply to say there was a 10-year period in which his job changed and his thinking changed, and he became ever more anti-Semitic because he was living in this world. I mean, Ibram Kendi, someone who I don't think much of a lot of his work, but in his first book, Stamped from the Beginning, which I think is actually a good work, he says racism does not start as hatred of blacks, which is actually exactly what Hannah Arendt says. He took it from Hannah Arendt. He doesn't cite her. It's okay. I don't think he read it. I mean, but the point is he agrees with Hannah Arendt. Racism starts not with hatred of Jews or hatred of blacks. It starts with the need to justify a system of discrimination that has come to seem unjustifiable. And so, you know, you had discrimination. And after a certain amount of time, that discrimination is part of society.
Right.
You have to justify it because you realize it's wrong. Common sense tells you it's wrong. And so you develop racism. And I think over time, Eichmann developed into a racist.
Right.
And I think Arendt thought that too. But so to call him banal doesn't mean he's not an anti-Semite. She thought he was an anti-Semite by the end. It's to say that he was able to justify what he was doing. He's able to say obscene things like, I was a Zionist, or I was trying to help the Jews, and not understand that from the Jewish perspective, he was taking their money and forcing them out of the country and then forcing them into camps and then forcing them to go to camps. And to think that he was just obeying the rules or being a good bureaucrat. And to argue and justify what he was doing, that's banality. And she says that kind of thoughtlessness is what mass murder and mass evil in the modern world depends on.
So it's taking the self-accountability out of it. That you just justify it because this is the norm, this is our culture. And as you said, in that 10-year span, that was the norm in Germany.
Exactly.
So no longer can you be the individual because the SS will come after you next if you say anything objectifying it, basically.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things she said that I thought was, I've always thought really interesting is Eichmann was asked at the trial, did anybody in all the 13 years that he worked for the Nazis, did anyone that you encountered ever say to you, what you're doing is wrong?
Yeah.
And he said no. He never encountered somebody who stood up for him. And he said, all the people who were, he's a high school dropout. All the people who have college educations, all the lawyers, all the judges I talked to, none of them said to me, how could you do this?
Yeah.
So he never actually encountered someone who stood up to him. That's why civil courage is such an important idea. Mm-hmm. That's why thinking and Moxie is such an important idea. Hannah Arendt says thinking has generally, in 99% of the cases, thinking has no impact on the world. The one time when thinking has an impact on the world is when the thinker encounters a world gone crazy where everyone's going along unthinkingly, and the thinker stops and asks questions. That's when the thinker politically matters. And so in her last book, which she never finished, called The Life of the Mind, she begins it with the question, could it be that thinking from the perspective of other people, questioning yourself, stopping and thinking, could it be that thinking is what could protect us from mass evil in the modern world? And she never answers that question, but that's the question she takes from the Eichmann experience.
Northeast Ford offers great sales and service, including a no-charge pickup and delivery for any service, even with oil changes. And they offer 2-year unlimited oil changes with any vehicle purchase, new or pre-owned.
Northeast Ford makes buying, selling, or trading in your car super easy. They have charging stations for your electric vehicle and a ready cash now offer and vehicle check on the spot if you wish to sell your vehicle. And they provide help with all the paperwork.
They service 6 counties, and they are located at 182 Route 44 in Millerton, where you can swing by and see Lan and his great sales team.
Or visit them online at www.northeastfordmillerton.com. So one of the things that I think about a lot in this age of technology and social media and addiction to flipping through things is I get scared that we're forgetting how to think because we're so invested in image and appearance. And I sometimes wonder what philosophers would make of what social media and addiction to technology is doing to our ability to break away and resist a lemming-like existence. And I'm just wondering what you could speculate she might say about the impact of that on us.
I think it's an excellent question. By the way, a quick ad here. The Hannah Arendt Center, which I run, has a conference every year in October. And the conference topic for this coming October is called Rage and Reason, Democracy Under the Tyranny of Social Media.
Ooh.
And it's about exactly the kind of question you just asked, right? Human beings are meaning-making creatures. And there's different ways we make meanings. One that has probably been our oldest and most deeply ingrained might be called tribalism. Mm-hmm. And we are tribal creatures, whether that's Jews and Christians or white and black, or whether it's woke people or MAGA people, right? And one of the real, I could call it an achievement, or I could call it just a fact of the Enlightenment age, the Western age, in some sense, from Rome until the present, was the development of reason as a counter to tribalism and rage, and the elevation of reason, science, and expertise as ways of creating knowledge that was thought to be non-tribal, objective, non-partisan, and the whole emergence of the Royal Academy in London up through Harvard in the 22nd century or 21st century is an attempt to say that there is a way of proceeding objectively, rationally, that's not tribal, that's not partisan, that's not based on emotion. That accomplishment or achievement is over. I mean, Arendt thought it was over. Mm-hmm. I think it's over. Mm. It's not coming back. This appeal to reason, this appeal to science, this appeal to expertise is now seen as tribal. And one of the most devastatingly dangerous happenings in our time is the emerging tribal war between those who are seen as experts and who value what experts say, and those who more rely on their physical common sense experience of a world subjectively emerged through their lives in small towns, in rural communities, in businesses, etc. And social media is not what caused this divide. But I do think that there is an aspect of social media that magnifies it in a dangerous way, and that's the algorithmic quality of social media. Look, there have been right-wing papers and left-wing papers for hundreds of years, mm-hmm. right? I mean, the objective newspaper is really a mid-20th century invention.
Right.
But what social media does is allow people not only to be caught in reading only one side, which always happened, but to be then fed an infinite amount of new information that is increasingly radical, developed by non-human, artificially intelligent algorithms that are able to, in some sense, without any theory and without any human knowledge, divine that someone who likes this conspiracy theory will also like that conspiracy theory, will like this idea and that idea, and drive people ever into smaller and smaller ideological niches. Mm. And that's a real danger. Because if I'm right that rage and reason, are two parts of humanity, and that the triumph of reason over the last 300 years is ending, we're entering a period of increased rage, increased emotion, increased tribalism. Again, that's normal. It's happened throughout history. But the power and speed with which algorithmic social media allows that to happen, that's radical, and that's new. And so that's what the conference is going to be talking about. And
well, we could put that in our show notes with the link so people know about it, because I think we should go. We have a few minutes, and I want to end with one more question on Arendt, and then I want to turn it to you about your own Moxie and the center and what you're trying to do at Bard through the Hannah Arendt Center. And we've talked about rage, and I want to come back to Arendt's Amor Mundi and her love of the world, and how I often marvel at people who see the worst and yet still come away with love. And how did she manifest that, or how did she come to that love of the world?
Well, she did see the worst. I mean, let's remember, This is a woman who grew up in Nazi Germany as a Jew, was imprisoned, was in a concentration camp. Okay, they weren't the worst concentration camps. Right. I'm not trying to exaggerate. She was stateless for 17 years. People could say, oh, well, she wasn't the worst. But the people who complain about how their lives are miserable today, mm-hmm. I mean, she lived through more than, many of them are today. And yet, she insisted that we love the world. amor mundi. What does that mean? It means for her that amidst the horrors and evil of the world, there are still what, I talked before about the lowest common denominator, the least common denominator. There's still good things. Mm-hmm. Our tradition, the world, still has beautiful things in it. There are books to read. There are friends. There are people. And that we shouldn't look away from the horrors. In fact, not at all. I mean, my favorite line, potentially in all of Arendt's work, is this line that comprehension, or understanding is another word she'll use, but comprehension is the unpremeditated, attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be.
Can you translate that?
Yeah.
You want it in German? No.
Just in simple English.
The unpremeditated, right? Without an ideological or view, right? A fully impartial, right? Not objective, but impartial in the sense of looking at it looking at the world in the way it is. Unpremeditated and attentive, attending to it, facing up to. Take the rose-colored glasses off and look at the world in its horrors, but also in its beauty, and resist it and love it, whatever it may be. We are allergic to reality. So I actually have a book coming out this month called The Perils of Invention. And it's about it's about how we are so terrified of what we see in the world that we spend all our time inventing fake news, fake stories, fake ideologies, coherent narratives to make the world seem more bearable. And Arendt, you talk about Moxie. Arendt's driving determination was to look at the world without invention, to look at the world as impartially and as honestly and as really and as unpremeditated and attentively as she could, and face up to it and resist it, but not deny it. And we live at a time of incredible denial. So yeah, I think that's where I think the level of her Moxie really lies.
Right. So turning to you and what you've created with the help of others in the college, I'm sure, but the Hannah Arendt Center, I feel like from what I know of it, you tried to create a Moxie in students to think critically, to act, to reflect, and to empathize. And I'm wondering if you can talk about some of that journey and what the priorities are and just anything you want to say about the center.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. I mean, the center's now started in 1906. 1906, that's when she was born. We had our first conference in 2006 on her 100th birthday. It probably, depending on how you date it, we started the center a little after. It was sort of an accident. I'm not going to go into that here. But when I did start the center, I specifically said that this is not a center dedicated to Hannah Arendt's work. People, look, first of all, people have different interpretations for work.
Right.
No one, and I would never say that everything she said is right, but it was dedicated to her spirit. Now, I used the word that she was someone who was bold, provocative, and surprising. I think Moxie is a translation of that. What I like about her work is that it's bold, provocative, and inspiring, that it makes people think, I always tell my students, if you take my class, you're going to come out less happy than when you came in, because my job is to disabuse you of the things that make your life comfortable, right? And, some of them love that and some of them don't. But that's what we do. I mean, that's what any good teacher, as far as I'm concerned, should do. And so the Arendt Center is designed to nurture and provide a space for the kind of bold, provocative, and surprising thinking in the spirit of Hannah Arendt. That's our mission. And we do that in many ways through we have student groups. One of the things we've done is students who really want to challenge themselves have come to us and said, we want to create a lecture series where we bring in people to Bard who have opinions that challenge the common sense on Bard. So we created a lecture series called Thoughtful Tough Talks, where you bring in people who are out of the mainstream, either far left or far right or whatever, and bring them in and do that. We have a Courage to Be lecture series where we bring in people who have acted courageously. These are student initiatives. We then have conferences and events, and again, designed to bring in speakers from wildly different points of view. People say to me, "Oh, you're just trying to be provocative." No. We don't bring a left and a right person. We bring in business people. We bring in artists. We bring in professors. We bring in novelists and poets. We bring in people with wildly different plural life experiences. And we ask them to try and talk about a common issue, whether it's rage and reason. Last year it was revitalizing democracy through citizen assemblies. Before that was racism and anti-Semitism, and we've had 16 of these at this point. And the idea is to really not, and I have a board, and my board always says, well, you have to have an outcome. And I was like, no, we don't have an outcome. We don't have an outcome. The outcome is we want people to think. The outcome is we want people to have more questions than when they started. And that's, that's an uncomfortable thing today. People want answers. I've been accused by many people of not being on the team. And I said, you're right, I'm not on the team. I'm not on anyone's team, except Hannah Arendt's maybe. But I'm not sure she would have me on her team, so that's presumptuous of me. But I like to think that we are doing something that she would recognize as a spiritual affinity to what she did in her work, without in any way claiming the depth or the intelligence or brilliance that she brought to it.
I promised you at the beginning that you could plug the virtual reading group, which is how I first came to know of your work. It was in the New York Times during COVID, a virtual book group to join, and I really enjoyed it. Got me through a number of months, and I want you to just talk about what that group is and what it's trying to accomplish. And I can put the link to it in the show notes, but yeah, just give us a little bit about that.
So as with many things in you do, the things that are sort of afterthoughts become the center thought, right? At one point, when the Arendt Center was very young, one of our board members said, you need to engage your members. And he's like, you should do something and you should give them things. And I was like, I don't want to give them things. I don't want to give them, cups and this and that.
I love my Hannah Arendt bag.
Okay, we do have swag, and some people think it's good swag, but I always was very skeptical of that, I have to say, but we do it. But I said, all right, well, what do? We think. We read and we think.
Right.
So I'll start a reading group. And, we started it with 10 people online. We used a thing called Blue Jeans. That was before Zoom existed, right? And it grew and grew. And, over the pandemic, so basically what do? We read a book. And we usually read about 20 to 30 pages a week. We meet every Friday. Just picked a time when it was convenient for me, to be honest. But we have people from 30 countries.
Wow.
We have somewhere between 100 and 200 people now most weeks. And we read 20 to 30 pages of Hannah Arendt, read the books through. And I usually give a 20 to 25, 30-minute introduction. And then I take questions. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there's conversations and engagements. And it's become a community. I mean, there's probably a group of 40 to 50 people who've been doing it for over 10 years. No, not 10 years, over 5 or 6 years. And then there's another 70 to 150 people that come irregularly. And I think people find it, you can tell me what you like about it, but I think people find it a respite from simple political name calling and simple political ideas. We read Arendt deeply and closely in order to understand what she says, but also in order to reflect on the world. And the way she makes you reflect on the world is always provocative and surprising and Moxie.
Yeah.
And And so we've brought together a group of people who are open-minded from wildly different backgrounds. We have truck drivers, Uber drivers, we have people who work in factories, we have cafe workers, and yet we also have professors, lawyers, academics, bankers. I mean, how many online groups include presidents of a bank, an Uber driver, a truck driver? I mean, I'm just telling you some people I know, a choreographer, an artist, and then academics. I mean, that kind of group coming together and reading a difficult but fascinating text seriously and talking about it for 90 minutes once a week, to me, that gives me hope. And it's become maybe the thing we do that I'm most proud of. So just part of what I love doing about the center.
Well, I enjoyed participating more then than I can now. But for those same reasons, I think you explain Arendt very clearly to non-academics to be able to grasp. And then I just feel that the conversations are people trying to tease out a knot, so they're just trying to just look at something and try to figure out how to access it. And I think people are concerned about the political. And her philosophy seems to just play right into that this is a way to think about the political, of acting in the world, of being with the world. And she was a very practical philosopher to me. She was really looking at problems and thinking about how do we approach this in a way that makes sense. So I think your virtual reading group just hits a home run with that in mind. And we just want to thank you so much for taking this time to be with us today, to talk about Hannah Arendt and be her proxy, and then also to talk about the center's work.
Well, thank you both very much. It's been a pleasure. And I told you earlier, I love these kind of conversations because I enjoy talking about Hannah Arendt because she makes me think and I never know what I'm going to say. And I'm sure I said some things today which will provoke and maybe give offense, but I hope not badly. And I hope make you think. That's what I really like to do. And I do it, my wife calls me a provocateur. I like to make people think.
Yes.
And what I say to people is, I'm actually not simply trying to provoke.
Mm-hmm.
I could provoke you I was trying to be very careful about the way I was saying it. If I wanted to provoke,
right,
I could have provoked. After a lot of these things that have happened to me and I've had like right-wing media call me up and say, can we put you on the air? And I say, look, I'll go on your air, but I'm not going to say what you want me to say.
Mm-hmm.
And then they never call back. But, so I don't want to be provocative in that way. I want to be thoughtful. And, we call our tough talks thoughtful tough talks. Get people to hear different opinions, but thoughtfully.
Well, this has been fantastic, and I enjoyed this so much. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Mary, that was a big one.
My head is about to explode.
There was so much.
Yeah, a longer episode.
That's okay.
But every bit of it was worth it.
And I don't think we even scratched the surface. There's so much. I wanted to talk to him for hours, and he said he's done that before plenty of times. So
I think he has the endurance to to go a couple of rounds about Hannah Arendt. But we did get into some great topics. We didn't fully cover her biographical life and how that shaped her. I think we got right into her thought, which I was happy about. Yeah. I don't know about you.
For sure. So what was your favorite part of it? Or your biggest takeaway? Let's put it that way.
My biggest takeaway was her bias to action, to thought, to motivate action in the political sphere, and to have an act in terms of having conversations.
Yes.
And finding that little area, that little piece of a Venn diagram where there's an overlap.
I like that
so
too.
that you can start building some understanding and empathy for differences.
Yeah. For me, having studied history for so long, the trial and that whole discussion, her covering it, and the definition of, I guess, evil and how society plays into it, I thought was really interesting. And, my historical studies were primarily, World War II, Nazi Germany. So I was having flashbacks to, all my years of study, but viewing it in that lens was really interesting to me. And in my head, when Roger was talking, I was drawing some parallels to today and our political sphere today, and some of the things that are being said on the news, whether
Right.
they be on the right or left. But, to me, it also goes to my own personal philosophy of you have to know history and what happened to understand what happened to bring us to today, and then not repeat the mistakes of yesterday type of thing. But I think that's really important, and just looking at that and her philosophy, her approach, and defining words, and that what you were just saying, the Venn diagram, finding the similarities, a common ground, as Roger was saying, I think it's so important, and it's so relevant even today in today's society and what we're going through today here.
Yeah, and our individualistic approach and us standing in not our truth, but in just ideology that we haven't maybe fully examined on whatever perspective we hold. And I liked her emphasis on thinking.
Yeah.
And understanding and having some self-awareness and being unafraid when you see something to say something.
But I like Roger's definition of Moxie and how he drew the parallels with her life with it. And but that truth factor and what he said about today we are so untruthful to ourselves, I found that to be a little scary. And maybe that's my biggest takeaway with how to view society and, look at it through that lens too. So I definitely learned something today.
Yeah, scary, but I have to come back to her having seen
Please
all
do.
that she has seen in her life.
Yes.
And ending up loving the world with warts and all, and looking to resist those parts of it that are evil and create those parts that are beautiful. So I'm really grateful that Roger was able to unpack Hannah for us so clearly.
Yes.
I think that's his secret sauce.
For sure.
And I hope our listeners really enjoyed that as much as we did.
And there's so much in the show notes from this one, so we
Absolutely.
really encourage everyone to take a look there. And the different things that we barely touched on, like Roger's new book, is all there. So take a look there.
And information about the center and its activities.
For sure. This episode is sponsored by Oblong Books and Northeast Ford.